Hello, my name is Hunt Allcott, and I'm a professor at Stanford University. I'm here to present my paper, An Economic View of Corporate Social Impact. It's joint work with Giovanni Montanari, Bora Ozaltun, and Brandon Tan. The core question we're interested in here is how can we measure corporate social impact? And of course, as you probably know, there are many existing rating systems for environmental and social and governance outcomes and risks, as well as corporate impact. For example, the rating systems listed on this slide. Many of you are familiar with Just Capital or Refinitiv or MSCI or the Harvard Business School impact-weighted financial accounts. Now, there's a key challenge in constructing any one of these systems, which is that it's not clear how to rigorously measure social impacts or ESG risks in different categories, and then combine across these measures in meaningful units. And a symptom of this problem is that there is substantial disagreement across rating systems, as evidenced by a series of papers that I cite here. The insight we had in starting this paper is that economics offers useful theoretical foundations and empirical tools to quantify a company's social impact in consistent units of dollars. So what we do in this paper is that we start with a conceptual framework where corporate social impact is the social welfare loss that would result if a firm exited the market. From that conceptual framework, we then implement a demonstration of that, where we quantify the social impact in dollars in the United States for 74 large companies across 12 different industries. Let me start by telling you about our framework and measurement. We measure, as I said earlier, the impact of a company's existence compared to it exiting the market that it has on consumers, shareholders, the environment, and its workers. And we weight low-income people more heavily than high-income people. To do this, we use a series of data sets, but really the primary thing that we use is a 3,500-person nationally representative survey. Now, in the formal paper, we write down the math of this framework. What I want to do here is just illustrate graphically how our framework works, starting with thinking about the impacts of a firm's existence compared to its exit on consumers, shareholders, and the environment. This takes the form of what economists call a partial equilibrium model, where imagine a company that's selling one good, has a demand function for its products that's illustrated here, where price is on the y-axis and quantity is on the x-axis. And this downward sloping line is, of course, the demand function. Imagine that the company is setting a price at this horizontal line. And so the current equilibrium is the bottom right black dot. The marginal cost that the firm has, imagine that's a little bit lower. And so the markup is this this vertical distance indicated in green. From here, we can then start to talk about the impacts that this firm and its product has on the world. So as usual in partial equilibrium analysis, the consumer surplus from the firm's existence is this blue triangle under the demand curve and above the current price. So that's the impact on consumers. The impact on shareholders is just the units sold times the markup, which is this upward sloping green shaded area here. Finally, imagine that the firm's product creates some externality. For example, using the product or making the product contributes CO2 emissions and thus worsens climate change. We can put that in units of dollars and imagine that this red bracket vertical distance is the amount of the externality per unit. Well, then the effect of that firm on the environment in dollar units is just this red shaded area here. Now, how do we actually calibrate this empirically for a given firm? Well, we're going to use the survey that I mentioned earlier. We work in 12 industries in that survey. So imagine there is a module in the survey that is about the auto industry. So imagine we're in that module and you're a consumer, a person in the United States taking this survey. We ask, do you have a car? And then if you have a car, we ask what brand your vehicle is. For example, Acura, Chevrolet, Ford, and all the other major brands. Imagine they then say, well, I own a Ford. The next question we ask is, imagine that the price of all Ford vehicles were 25% higher. Would you still have chosen a Ford even at the higher price? Yes or no? So notice what this does is this from the survey tells us the share of Ford owners that tell us on the survey that they still would have bought from Ford even at the higher price. That gives us the slope of this demand curve that I was describing earlier. And we know this second, the upper left point on the demand curve, the change in quantity from a hypothetical 25% price increase. So given that slope of demand and the current price of a product, we can then estimate the consumer surplus generated by Ford in this example. We'll use the model, and in particular, what is standard in industrial organization economics, a so-called static Nash-Bertrand set of pricing assumptions to infer the marginal cost that firms must have faced that rationalizes the price given the demand slope that they faced. We then use that same model to predict what the equilibrium in this case, the auto market would be if, for example, Ford exited the market. Well, that means that all of Ford's competitors would be able to charge a higher price. Ford's competitors would earn more profits because they get all of Ford's consumers at a higher price. And so that's the impact on Ford's competitors. And then to quantify this externality, we'll just use standard accounting assumptions. For example, how much a Ford car is driven over its lifetime typically, and what are the CO2 damages from those emissions. So that's how we calculate this part of it. I mentioned also that we consider a firm's impact on workers. So that can be thought of in a graphic like this one, where workers are now supplying labor to the market at a given wage. And so we have this upward sloping labor supply curve. And this is, in this specific example, Ford's upward sloping labor supply curve. And so the surplus that Ford delivers to its workers relative to their outside option of working at some other company is the area above this residual supply curve that Ford faces. So again, the question we want to ask here is, well, what is the slope of a given company's residual supply curve? And to do that, we resort back to our survey. So again, this is stated preference on a survey, and we ask the following question. Imagine your primary employer faced major new competition and had to permanently cut everyone's salary by 10%. Would you keep working there even at the lower salary? And so from there, we can get a second point on the supply curve at 10% lower salary. From there, we know the slope of that supply curve. We then project those slopes. Those slopes could vary across companies. Some companies might have very flat labor supply. Others might have very steep labor supply depending on their characteristics. And so we project this onto each firm in our sample, each of the 74 firms, given workers' average earnings, education, occupation, employer size, and the local labor market size in the specific places where that firm has establishments around the country in the United States. So that's our methodology. Let me now move on to describe our results. This is first a descriptive plot of the own price elasticity and average customer income from our survey and from other sources of customer income. There is one type of dot for each of the differentiated product industries in our sample: airlines, autos, beer, cereal, cigarette, groceries, restaurants, smartphones, soda, toothpaste, and yogurt. Let's first focus on the y-axis here. This is the own price elasticity from the survey that each firm faces. So for example, Hyundai is the most price elastic firm. That means that on our survey, the people who said that they own Hyundais were the most willing to substitute away to another firm if Hyundai hypothetically increased their prices by 25%. The firms at the top of this graph, Hyundai, Spirit Airlines, Frontier, Kia, Nissan, Mazda, Subaru, these are the companies that face the most elastic demand. That means that their consumers have the easiest time substituting away to other competing products if that firm were to exit the market. That's going to mean that that demand curve that I showed you earlier is particularly flat for these firms, and thus that they generate relatively little consumer surplus. Intuitively, Hyundai consumers are perfectly happy to go buy from another company if Hyundai didn't exist anymore. Now go down to the bottom of this graph, where the firms that have the most inelastic demand, that includes Aldi, Winco, Apple, BMW. These are the firms where consumers said, gosh, if the price went up by 25%, I would still buy from these same firms. That means that these firms face relatively steep demand on the graph earlier. Consumers have a hard time substituting away. They're generating lots of consumer surplus through their products. Now let's look at the x-axis, average customer income. And you can see the highest income firms are Alaska Airlines, Mercedes, BMW, Amazon. This is Amazon Groceries. The lowest customer income firms are LG Smartphones, the Android smartphone maker, RJ Reynolds Tobacco, Walmart, Google Smartphones, Winco Groceries, and Kia Cars up here near the top. In our model, as I alluded to earlier, we're going to give higher weight to the consumer surplus of companies that are generating surplus for lower income consumers. Social welfare, we can debate over the curvature of that function, but intuitively what we wanted to do in this paper is give more weight to companies that are delivering value to lower income folks. And so the companies at the left are going to have their consumer surplus upweighted because they're delivering that value to lower income consumers. So I haven't given you the final impact numbers, but this is going to start to give an intuition for what firms are going to be where. Let me now give you some of those numbers, focusing on one specific industry to start, which is the auto industry. This is a figure that shows the components of the components of corporate social impact for the major firms in the auto industry: BMW, Fiat, Chrysler, Ford, GM, etc., from left to right. Each of these bars in the different colors is the magnitude of impact that the company has on the different dimensions that we're quantifying in units of dollars. Consumer surplus, to start, that's in light blue. And you can see that the firms that deliver the largest consumer surplus are generally the largest firms in the US market. So Ford, GM, and Fiat Chrysler, along with Toyota and Honda, are particularly generating more consumer surplus. And when we go from the unweighted estimates, which is the left bar, to the weighted estimates, meaning that we're now upweighting lower income consumers, the companies that have the biggest change proportionally are Hyundai and Kia. Exactly as we'd pointed out earlier, these are the companies that have the lowest income consumers. And so when we go from unweighted on the left to weighted on the right, we're increasing the amount of consumer surplus that we attribute. Now, when a company exits the market, there's a loss of worker surplus. So that's the dark blue. It's also earning profits. So there's a loss of profits. And then there's a gain to competitors' profits, which is this light green that you see. So the company's existence is now generating positive consumer surplus, positive worker surplus, positive profit for its shareholders. But the things that are below the y-axis, these are harms to the world. And that is the externality generated by the firm's products through climate change, through the use of the products, and competitors' profits. The fact that Ford and GM are in the market, for example, means that their competitors are earning less profits than they would otherwise. And so that's something that we account for in this hypothetical where we're thinking about the benefits of a firm existing relative to exiting. Let me now transition to talking about the top 10 and bottom 10 firms. Ask yourself, out of these 74 firms in the industries we discussed, what do you think are the top 10 firms by social impact? Let me show you now. The number one firm by social impact, according to our analysis, is Walmart in the grocery industry. Why is that? It's a big company, so it's selling a lot of products, and it's delivering that consumer surplus to relatively low-income consumers. And so we're upweighting that large consumer surplus that's generated. A different question you might ask is, well, I knew Walmart was large. Let's normalize social impact instead by revenues. So let's ask, who is generating the most social impact per dollar of revenues? Ask yourself what industry that might be in our model. And this may be a surprise to some people. The number one firms in terms of social impact per dollar of revenue are all in the oil industry. Now, why would that be in our model? In our model, oil generates substantial negative externalities because of climate change. But it also generates, in our model, much larger, and in fact, offsettingly much larger consumer surplus. Why is that? When oil prices rise, we know that demand for oil is very inelastic, and when oil prices rise, that is really bad for consumers, and in particular, low-income consumers. Think about what happened when Russia invaded Ukraine, and there were oil prices went up. That was bad for consumers. And so that matters in our model. When any one of these firms hypothetically exits, that generates harm to consumers that, at least in our model, outweighs the damages that these firms create through climate change. So I thought this was a very provocative result that comes out of the data when put into the model. In my final 2 minutes or so, let me describe now the bottom 10 firms as measured by corporate social impact in our model. Ask yourself what those might be in our 12 industries. The worst firms, number 73 and 74, are cigarette companies. Why is that? Well, consumers buy cigarettes, but we use outside estimates of the consumer harms, so-called internalities, that are caused by cigarettes. And those harms are so large as to outweigh the apparent consumer surplus that you would infer on the basis of consumers using those products. Spirit and Frontier are also relatively low ranked. That's because their products generate externalities and because their consumers are perfectly happy to substitute away to some other airline if they were to exit the market. Let me now conclude by first showing you the relationship between our metrics and other metrics, and in particular the CSR Hub and Just Capital rating. Our metric is on the x-axis, the other metrics are on the y-axis, and I've put CSR Hub in red and Just Capital in green. If they were perfectly aligned, you would expect to see all of these dots on the 45-degree line. Instead, you see a big mess of different, just a big mess of dots. The implication being other systems estimates of CSR ratings or ESG scores or the different things that these two things are rating are uncorrelated with our economically grounded quantitative metric. Okay, so let me conclude just by highlighting the limitations and strengths. There are many limitations of what we've done here. We have a benefit cost analysis effectively that derives from a utilitarian moral philosophy. You might want to have another moral philosophy going into this. Within our moral philosophy, we make static partial equilibrium assumptions that I list here. And then our empirical implementation, of course, requires a series of assumptions. But what are the strengths and the takeaways? We've delivered here a theoretically grounded and internally consistent system where all impacts are measured in units of dollars. It can easily be applied to other companies or industries or to specific business decisions that a company might want to make. And it delivers an important insight, which is that consumer surplus is by far the most important component of social impact. And thus, I'll leave you with the keys in our model to a company generating social impact. Don't make deeply harmful products, serve low-income people, and make differentiated products that more people want to buy. Thank you very much.